Okay, we're going to look into the prehistory population of Egypt and through its history. We saw this in a recent video that I had as one of the links down at the bottom, and I said, I'm going to do one about that. Well, looking into it, I'm going to do one about it. I would like up front for you to know that there is an Afrocentric involved in the writing of this literature, and you can kind of tell. And as we read through it, you'll be able to see somehow this ping pong ball keep going back and forth a little bit mentally, and what you think might be the truth. And it seems to have been done that way almost on purpose, but we'll be able to fight through it. And I play ping pong pretty good. Egypt has a long and involved demographic history. This is partly due to the territory's geographic location and the crossroads of several cultural areas. North Africa, which is Caucasian endemics, the Middle East, Caucasians, the Mediterranean, Caucasians, all the way around the whole entire Mediterranean, no other people involved, and Sub-Saharan Africa, if you could go across a 200-mile desert. In addition, Egypt has experienced several invasions during its long history, including by the Canaanites, the ancient Libyans, the Assyrians, and the Cushites, which they call a Nubian civilization, although I believe it's controlled by others, but that's another story. The Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, and then finally the Arabs that live there today. So the ancient population that ran into these at least first four things aren't these last people that had come in. And so let's look at a few of these and just see what we're talking about here. Canaanites is really a demographic area that, depending on which way you look at it, it's either right there by Jerusalem and that's it, or it's actually all the way through the front of Egypt and all the way around through Anatolia, and the whole area is considered the Levant. And in most situations, that's what we refer to it. In the Bible, it takes it down to a few places because they refer to Phoenicians, although the Phoenicians refer to themselves as Canaan, and that's where the whole name came from. And therefore, they're not just people that are at 2 or 3 ports here and then over in Carthage or whatever, but all those people were actually Canaanites. Then you have the ancient Libyans, and what's neat about this, and you can see in this picture here, is that this is actually the picture that goes with Ethiopians, which we'll be able to speak about here shortly. And you can look at the picture here and probably make out where everything is, but the large blob in the bottom that says Libya in it is actually the ancient name for Africa. Yeah, it was named Libya, the whole thing pretty much, before it got named Africa, later after a Caucasian with a whole battle and everything that went on in Carthage, but that's later. You can also tell by this picture they don't know Sub-Saharan African exists, that, well, let's see if I can do this without it walking away from me. You can also see that there are the Macrobians, which the ancient Greeks said that they were beautiful people, very tall of stature and long-lived Caucasians. And then they talk about the Ethiopians that are here. And strangely, you can see that the Nile comes up and turns and runs off into the Atlas Mountains. This is what they believed had happened at that time, so surely he didn't go to the end of the Nile. But also Meroe is somehow kicked over on here. Meroe is named after Persian leader Cambyses' sister. So, another interesting fact is that everywhere that's brown here on this map, all this area, over here by Celts and Iberia, all the way through, and if you'll look, it always attaches to the end of rivers, and always where the river valleys run out. So actually, in some forms, it really just means farmers, rednecks, or people with a tan in some way, because it said sunburnt faces, and farmers definitely get sunburnt faces and rednecks. And so whenever they talk about ancient Ethiopians in Greek, it really has nothing to do with the current country that's up here by these Microbians and the population that's up there at that time. And of course, there's a lot of people who try to argue that point. But then if you ever show them that, well, if we take the people that made up the word and what they meant it to mean versus some country that used to be called Abyssinia until recently and blah, 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 and those people that might live in that country, and looked at every place they called it, it seems to be everywhere. In fact, conspicuously, it's all right here in the Caucasus Mountains, too. So, Caucasians, well, yeah, yes, these are all Caucasians. In fact, this whole map is all Caucasians. They don't have the point of India down here, but then the Denisovan Cross India would be down here. And, of course, what was the guy's name? Radio 1. Yeah, he thinks he knows everything. Made a fool out of himself by saying that I said that over here was Ethiopians and that they were only here, pointing it out. And I didn't catch that he had said it before, but 7 Phoenicians 7 did, and made clear indication that he knew it was there and talks about it. Shows it in a video, which I'm going to have to do one on. She did another video too, and it pretty much did what I was going to try to do in a video, but better. So I just kind of dropped that little thing, and I'm trying to compile another one to put it together, but I think he's really just destroyed. Let's continue here anyhow. So, then you have Assyrians, and the Assyrians are up here at the top of the Tigris and Euphrates above the ancient Sumerian types, and then we have the Mitanni state that's there. They also draw themselves in this strange red ochre for the males and pale for the women. So do the Hittites, so do people that are all out here in the Minoans, the Greeks, and all these other people, just like the Egyptians do. And so it's a kind of a localized thing, all this Caucasian edict where the women stay pale and the men are red ochre symbology, and it seems to be going all the way back to Cro-Magnon and caveman times whenever they would do red ochre burials, and all the cave paint art that we all see that's made out of red ochre, and these red ochre people. Done a lot of videos about them and stuff. Then you have the Cushites, the Nubians, with them, but it wasn't a Nubian run, it was a Cushite run, by the way. And then Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, and then the Arabs. So let's look into this. During the Paleolithic period, the Nile Valley was inhabited by various hunter-gatherer populations. So way back when. Around 8000 BC, the Sahara had a wet phase, the Neolithic subpluvial or Holocene wet phase. People from the surrounding areas moved into the Sahara, and evidence suggests that the populations of the Nile Valley reduced in size. So what's that? Well, perhaps they spread out a whole lot more than they were just in a couple of clusters. And this is kind of pre-proto farming, so they aren't locked down just yet. Hey, and they move quite a bit, but this also connects to the Green Sahara that was still going on and reactive quite well. And in some of these old maps show you an ancient river that runs all the way through there and all these side basins. A recent look at this showed that they're Caucasians, and there's 2 groups that are there too. One is an earlier, one's a little bit later, and the first group seems very big and Cro-Mag too, and very hardy, and they talk about it, and I think in here they may speak of it too. Pre-dynastic Egypt is conventionally said to begin about 6000 BC, so this is Proto-Egyptian or whatever if you want to call it. From around 4800 to 4300 BC, the Memrid culture, which is Memrid Beni Salam, flourished in Lower Egypt. This culture, among others, has links to the Levant, the pottery of the Buto-Mahdi culture, best known for the site at Mahdi near Cairo. Also shows connection with the southern Levant in Upper Egypt, and the pre-dynastic Badari culture was also followed by the Naqada culture, also kind of called Amratian. Around 300 or 3000 BC, the wet phase of the Sahara came to an end. And so when people talk about all this erosion that happened way back when, it really can come up to in the 3000 range and so on. But this still says that if all this rain was going on, that Sphinx was probably built before that time. And well, I've got a video coming up on that and a slight reveal too, but something totally different. I say it was these populations, in addition to the Neolithic farmers from the Near East, that likely played a role in formation of the Egyptian state, as they brought their food, crops, sheep, goats, and cattle to the Nile Valley. And indeed, they had done it very much Proto-Egyptian, because Hathor and the goddess and all that was already in play quite early along in that. And I've shown recent videos about Shimsu-Hor and the followers of Horus, and how this falcon god out of Sumeria seems to all of a sudden show up over here and make an extreme prominence. That also has to do with the Sphinx, but we'll get to that in another video. But all the grain, all the food crops that they have, all the sheep and animals aren't endemic to Africa in any way, and they were brought there and already domesticated at the point that they had come. So this is a cultural blending together. Now we can look at this and say the lower part was definitely Caucasians, and then a blend in. They talk about Badari up in the centralist area, and now they were Caucasians. And of course, what's funny about that naming is Bod means city. This was some of the first city dwellers, if they will. So Bod means city in German, and Aryan in German means, what's it mean? It means, I forget. Located in the general extreme northeast corner of Africa, ancient Egyptian society was at the crossroads between the Africa and Near Eastern regions. Early proponents of the dynastic theory, based on its increased novelty and seemingly rapid change in pre-dynastic pottery, noted trade contacts between ancient Egypt and the Middle East. They noticed that pottery changes go on, and until we had genetics, that's pretty much what we had to mess with. There's no longer the dominant view. This is no longer the dominant view, though, in Egyptology. However, the evidence on which it was based still suggests influence from these reasons. So in other words, they've tried to say that it all stands alone now, but then again, all that evidence is still there with the cylinder seals that directly come from Sumeria and the earliest depictions of the Master of Beasts and things along that line that show you that, oh yeah, they're well involved here. So what goes on? Well, genetics is trying to reveal all of that at a later point here. Farrakhi, Hassan, and Edwin, and others point to mutual influence from both Inner Africa as well as the Levant. This evidence suggests that ancient Egypt was populated by Afro-Asiatic speaking peoples from North Africa and the Near East. So definitely not the Negroids. The only Negroids in the area were, oh, by the way, it shows that at the very bottom of the paper. So here's another one of those you might ping pong, but don't. Let me show you this. The very bottom of the paper, it tells you that, oh, I'm not even there yet. Oh, here I am. Oh, here it is. Bottom line, the language of the neighboring Nubian people is one of Nilo-Saharan languages and is not of the Afro-Asiatic languages. Meanwhile, back to the farm. Where was I? Right in here. Around 3000 BC, the wet phase came to an end. The Saharan populations retreated to the south towards the Sahel and east in the direction of the Nile Valley. It was these populations, in addition to Neolithic farmers from the Near East, that likely played a role of formation of Egyptian state as they brought their food crops. Farrakhi, Hassan, and Edwin and others point to a mutual influence of both Inner Africa as well as the Levant. This evidence suggests that ancient Egypt was populated by Afro-Asiatic peoples from the North Africa and Near East. So Caucasians and Caucasians. Maria Gatto has suggested that the makers of the pre-dynastic Egyptian Akkad culture centered in Upper Egypt shared an almost identical culture with the A group peoples in Lower Nubia. But a deeper look into that shows you that that's not true really, and it shows you what that connection, false connection, was made. I'll get to that in 1 second. This is based in part on the similarities with the royal tombs at Questel. Joseph Vogel, Sheikh Diop, of course we know about him, and Volney and others have been even proposed an Egyptian origin in Numia among the A group. Volney recounted, Joseph Vogel relented, and Sheikh Anti-Diop is a Senegalese Negroid man who wants everyone to believe that the Senegalese somehow built the pyramids. And not the West Africans, they had nothing to do with it. But the West Africans want to say that they were it too, and of course there's no connection whatsoever to those people, but they do like to covet that and the Bible and other things and stuff. It's terrible in America. I don't know where you are, but they hop around mad that they're all that. They even have these little clown outfits that they wear and stand on street corners and yell at white people and say that white people aren't part of the Bible, but black people are. It's weird. It's real weird, and the most racist thing in the world right now. by the way, no matter what you look at, because given the opportunity for what they could do with the opportunity given, they choose to hate the people that are trying to help them out. But let's look at this A group peoples of Lower Nubia and its supposed connection. Now this is between the first and second cataracts that they found this at here with this A group. So when we look at A group culture, first and second cataracts of the Nile was around 3800 BC to around 3100. And they say, oh, okay, so let's lead right into Egypt. And so what happened during the formation? Well, in 1907, the Egyptologist George A. Reisner first discovered the artifacts belonging to A group culture. Early hubs of this civilization included Kabanyanya and North and Buhin in the south, with Aswan, Sayala, Toshka, and Questel in between. The A group markers maintain commercial ties with the ancient Egyptians. So in other words, they are not the ancient Egyptians, but commercial ties. They trade commodities like incense, ebony, and ivory, which were gathered from the southern riverine area. They also bartered carnelian from the western desert, as well as gold mined from the eastern desert, in exchange for Egyptian products, olive oil, and other items from the Mediterranean basin. Excavations at an A group cemetery in Crestwell yielded an old incense burner. Oh, we had to do a video about this. I think it was 7 Phoenician 7, or was it a Super Egyptian that did the one that totally debunked this? I think one of them did the headrest, the other one did the incense burner. It could have been both 7P. Anyhow, which was adorned with ancient Egyptian royal iconography. Oh no. However, further research established that the antecedents of the pre-dynastic Egyptian regala. In other words, listen closely. The earliest known examples of Egyptian royal iconography, such as the presentation of the red crown on the late Nakata I, around 3500 BC, so it wasn't on the thing that everybody thinks it was. It predates that. And a pottery vessel from Abydos are the triumphal scenes and the painting from Hierakonpolis tomb, number 100, which is 3400 to 3300 BC, and in some of the videos I do about pre-dynastic Egypt, are much older than the Questel censer. So it seems thus that it would be the Questel rulers who adopted symbols of the royal authority developed in Caucasian Egypt, and in no way the vice versa. Yeah, this is a definite debunk for the people that said black people were running around and gave them this real cool stuff, and then they went dumb and ran off. And that's exactly what the guy tried to say pretty much happened, and at the same time, they stole an incense burner and some other crap. I forget what the stupid black guy was trying to say in that one, but it's always different in something, and it always involves whitey bad. And so anyhow, realizing this, that's the where that it came from, so let's see. A group markers left behind a number of cemeteries with each necropolis containing around 50 graves. Much of which is known about this culture has been gleaned from these tombs, over 3,000 of which have been excavated. The burials are of two kinds: the more common oval pit and a similar pit featuring a lateral funerary niche. Skeletons found within these graves were observed to be physically akin to their peers in Upper Egypt. The specimens typically had straight hair of a black or dark brown hue, but when they say typically, there were blondes and redheads found too, but they won't mention it because they say typically. You can see that. So if it's typically all this, then what's the non-typical out of it? If you said 90% of them are brown or black hair, then what are the 10? Let's continue. On average, the men were 169.9 centimeters in height, and the women stood around 155. Some individuals were wrapped and positioned in reed mats. All of the tombs contains various burial items, including personal ornaments, utensils, and ceramics. The A group culture came to an end around 3100 BC when it was destroyed, apparently by the first dynastic rulers of Egypt. And then they didn't show up for over 400 years, close to 5, before Nubian C ever showed up. And then Nubian C is shown as being something totally different, and they wondered if they actually even wiped out this slight culture subgroup, or they never returned again. Dental trace analysis of A group fossils found that they were closely related to Afro-Asiatic speaking populations of Northeast Africa and the Maghreb. Along the ancient populations, the A group people were nearest the Kerma culture, burials of Kush populations way up in Upper Egypt, followed by Meroitic and X group in the Christian period inhabitants of Lower Nubia, and Kelis. And if you look now, the Lower Nubia definitely has a whole lot of Caucasians. It's really a Caucasian society, and Upper Nubia still has more Negroids in it. But as well as C group and Pharaonic era skeletons excavated in Lower Nubia and ancient Egyptians, showing you that Nubians are not ancient Egyptians, separate. Nakata, Badari, Heracanopolis, Abydos, and Karga in Upper Egypt, Hawara in Lower Egypt. Among the recent groups, the A group markers were morphologically closest to Afro-Asiatic-speaking populations of the Horn of Africa, followed by the Shiwa and Kaile Berber populations of Algeria as Bedouin groups of Morocco, Libya, and Tunisia. The A group's dental morphology has been found to be phenotypically distinct from those belonging to recent Negroid populations in sub-Saharan Africa. So in other words, if there's anybody whatsoever that they can dismiss of having any connection or being anywhere near, it's sub-Saharan West African Negroids that are trying to claim Egypt. Isn't that hilarious? Let's continue. Where was I at? A group, dating techniques. However, most scholars have rejected this hypothesis. I skipped a point. In 1996, Lowland Prose reported the presence of individual rulers buried at Nakata in what they interpreted to be elite high-status tombs, showing them to be more closely related morphologically to populations in northern Nubia than those in southern Egypt. And I did a video on this, and the stuff that's inside of those actually shows you this Sumerian influx, and it doesn't have anything to do with Nubians at all. But there's another ding. Here's somebody writing something like fluff. Let's look at this further. However, most scholars have rejected this hypothesis and cite the presence of royal tombs that are contemporaneous with those in Questel and just as elaborate, together with problems with the dating techniques. Again, slap. Toby Wilkinson, in his book Genesis of the Pharaohs, proposes an origin for the Egyptians somewhere in the eastern desert. In addition, there is evidence that sheep and goats were introduced into the Nabda Playa from Western Asia about 8,000 years ago. And now we're talking about these Anatolians and these Proto-Indo-European people that had been up there and stuff. That's where that animal comes from, so what's up with that? There is some speculation that this culture is likely have been the predecessor of Egyptians, based on cultural similarities, social complexity, which is thought to be reflective of the old kingdom of Egypt. And they have bull effigies and all this stuff in there, and you could see how Hathor could come from it, and a lot of things too. And I asked 7P if we could put together something that works with the ancient people that were right there in the Levant, because these people, or a couple of them, have tried to connect Egyptians to them, and then other people have tried to connect Catalhoyuk to those people too. And if you can make that connection, it's kind of like they were here, and here they are, and yep, they're in Egypt. And that's the end of that one. And also to do the ancient Sumerian ones, if we can get any ancient Sumerian, and perhaps nobility versus a commoner, and see if there's any slight variation on a theme that's in that. Anyhow, guys, DNA studies, though, contamination from handling and intrusion from microbes created obstacles in the recovery of ancient DNA. Consequently, most DNA studies have been carried out on modern Egyptian populations with the intent of learning about the influences of historical migrations on the population of Egypt. So they tried to do a test where they test old through out of a graveyard, and because they're all in that one area, they thought they would see this influx and this change, and it would teach them a whole lot about stuff, and then compare that to ancient Greek and Persian and stuff population to see the influx, and they could really glean a lot more information. Kind of disappointing on that front that it really showed continuity and that it didn't change, and that there was an extreme low amount of Negroid admix in them, if any at all, and then that really shows up much later. Let's look at what they say. Blood typing and DNA sampling on ancient Egyptian mummies is scant. However, a study published in 1982 found that blood typing of ancient mummies found ABO frequencies to be most similar to modern Egyptians, and some also to northern Horatian populations. ABO blood group distribution shows that the Egyptians form a sister group to North African Caucasian populations. A study published in 2017 described the extraction and analysis of DNA from 151 mummified ancient Egyptian individuals whose remains were recovered from Absur Melek in Middle Egypt. These scientists said that obtaining well-preserved, uncontaminated DNA from the mummies has been a problem for the field, and that these samples provided the first reliable data set attained from ancient Egyptians using high-throughput DNA sequencing methods. The specimens presented a period stretching from the late New Kingdom, and I thought it went a little earlier than that, to the Roman area, so 1388 all the way to 426 AD, if you will, or Common Era. So they thought they would see this big change. Problem is, complete mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA, sequences were obtained for 90 of the mummies and were compared with each other and several other ancient modern data sets. The scientists found that the ancient Egyptian individuals in their own data set possessed high similarity mitochondrial profiles throughout the examined period. So, modern Egyptians generally shared this maternal haplogroup pattern, but also carried more African clades. So, this is a difference. If you'll notice the difference in what was said word for word here versus the last video I did, you'd see something very revealing on who is probably writing this one versus who is writing the other one. But also carried more African clades. Yeah, it's like 3 times the percent and goes from almost nothing to actually some admix, but some 16 to 20% maybe or something, if that's what it was, and of Negro admix. And of course that's after Arabics and the people that are there now, and they have admix from their involvement in the Arabic and Islamic slave trade. So, bingo. Let's continue. However, analysis of the mummies' mtDNA haplogroups found that they are shared greater mitochondrial affinities with modern populations of the Near East Caucasians and the Levant Caucasians compared to modern Egyptians. So in other words, they're more related to them. Here's a sneaky way of what he just said there, but they're actually more related, and they leave out European. But European farmers and Anatolian people and the Levant people are more related to the Egyptians than the current people living in Egypt. Additionally, 3 of the ancient Egyptian individuals were analyzed for Y-DNA and were observed to bear paternal lineages that are common in both the Middle East and North Africa, Caucasians. The researchers cautioned that the affinities of the examined ancient Egyptian specimens may not be representative of those all ancient Egyptians, since they were from a single archaeological site, but spanning the whole age. When we look at craniofacial criteria, this is the way that a skull is built and the way that it's made. By the way, here's a picture of what they think is Akhenaten, and the reason that they really think it is where they found it at, in the position that they did, and then on top of that, he has an extreme long horse face. And Akhenaten is drawn with that strange horse face, so they're like, oh, he's got a skinny head, horse face, maybe this is Akhenaten. Anyhow, you can tell genetics. Craniofacial was one of the better things to do, but there was so much confusion in all of it. Really a lot of conjecture, and then people were finding admix people and trying to compare it to admix people and all kinds of things, and even some far-edging things where they were like, well, it goes from 1 to 10 and here's a 9, so everybody's that. And it's like, no, that's so close to it, the 20 to 30, that it's closer to 20 to 30 than it is to 1 or 5, right? And so which one is which and all this, oh, it's just a big mess. But let's look into this and watch this ping pong ball hop around. The use of craniofacial criteria as reliable indicators of population grouping or ethnicity has been a long-standing focus of biological anthropology. Where am I at here? 29, we'll keep going. In 1912, Franz Boas argued that cranial shape was heavily influenced by environmental factors and could change within a few generations under differing conditions. And yeah, sure, you put somebody from one area that has all these traits in another area, and they can start to change and stuff, and especially this goes with cold climate and warm climate with longer limbs, shorter limbs, and all these things. Thereby making a cephalatic index an unreliable indicator of inherited influences such as ethnicity. So they just want to discount it and walk away from it, and he wrote a whole paper about it. Gravely, Bernard and Leonard in 2003, Beale, Smith, and Dodd in 1984, and Williams and Armalagos 2005 similarly posited that race and cranial variation had low correlations and proposed that cranial variation was instead strongly correlated with climate variables. And you'll see the guy that wrote this is going to try desperately to get out and try to discredit any craniofacial criteria whatsoever and just blend it all together and make you confused by the end of it. Let's continue. Brace 1993 differentiated adapted cranial traits from non-adaptive cranial traits, asserting that only the non-adaptive cranial traits served as reliable indicators of genetic relatedness between populations. Makes sense, and this was fervently corroborated by in studies by von Kramer and Traubel in 2008 and 2009 and 2011. Clement and Ranson in 1998 estimated that cranial analysis yields a 77 to 95% rate of accuracy in determining the racial origins of human skeleton remains. So when you ask them to take a shot at it, though, they don't necessarily, and this guy omits the ones that did. A craniofacial study by C. Loring Brace and others in 93 concluded that the pre-dynastic Egyptians of Upper and late dynastic Egyptians of Lower Egypt were closely related to each other. In other words, yeah, we talked about those Caucasians down at the Delta, and all of them are Caucasians, damn it. They also showed that general ties with other Afro-Asiatic speaking populations in North Africa, Neolithic and modern Europeans, boing, and India people, but not at all with populations of sub-Saharan Africa. I'm going to highlight that for you again just real quick, but not at all with these people from sub-Saharan Africa. Eastern Asia, Oceania are the Americas. So what they're saying here is it doesn't have anything to do with Japanese and Chinese people. It doesn't have anything to do with Oceania and the island people that even have dark skin, because those aren't related to Negroids at all either, nor the people of the Americas, in other words, the Amerindians. So who does it? Oh, the Europeans? North Africa, Neolithic, and modern Europeans? Huh. Okay. Adjacent people in the Nile Valley show similarities in trivial traits in an unbroken series from the Delta in the north southward through Nubia and all the way to Somalia at the equator. At the same time, the gradient in skin color and body proportions suggest long-term adaptive response to selective forces appropriate to latitude where they occur. So now what we're saying is Caucasians get tan whenever they're closer to the equator, i.e. the Beach Boys and people in lower Florida are going to be pretty well tanned, and if they worked outside all day, you betcha. But then, an assessment of race is as useless as it is impossible, they say, backing away from it, right after they just told you they had a 75 to 90% rate. So this guy's writing in here, neither clines nor clusters alone suffice to deal with the biological nature of a widely distributed population. Both must be used, he also commented. We conclude that the Egyptians have been in place since back in the Pleistocene and have been largely unaffected by either invasions or migrations. So in other words, Caucasian, 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 Caucasian. As others have noted, Egyptians are Egyptians, and they were so in the past as well. Joseph Dinnicker and other early anthropologists similarly noted that the oval cranial form of Ethiopid, which we just talked about Ethiopian and how that's really not a correct term at all, but we know what we're talking about. Near Eastern Semitic and Berber ethnic groups, all of whom speak Hamo-Semitic languages, are largely the same, and those are Caucasians. And there are some admixed people off into there too, but we're not going to say that was going on long ago, whenever no one had crossed the Sahara yet or anything along that line. Egyptologist Barry Kemp, 2005, has reviewed the available skulls and skeletal evidence in the ancient Egyptians. He observed that the skeletons from earlier periods, which helped to elucidate the origin of pre-dynastic Egyptians, are rare, with one of the few examples being bodies recovered from the late Stone Age cemetery at Gabel Sahaba. So here we're talking about what I talked about before. In the northern Sudan, Kemp states that these people certainly would not have looked like pre-dynastic Egyptians or Nubians. but instead they shared features with a population of earlier Homo sapiens called Cro-Magnon, which are found spread across North Africa and Europe. So now we're saying, hey, there's this gigantic big whitey cracker in Egypt. Kim states that it's dangerous to take one set of skeletons and use them to characterize the population of the whole of Egypt. Well, sure, yeah, especially if it doesn't correspond with it, and then you can peg it to be Cro-Magnons, and you're like, well, these guys don't show to be a Cro-Magnon. So, of course, if you tried to put that together, you couldn't put it together, but yet it shows another phase of Caucasians right there. He notes that the pre-dynastic skulls from Upper Egypt appear to be noticeably different than their measurements from Old Kingdom group from tombs around the pyramids of Giza, and one investigator has consequently claimed that the pyramid builders were a different race from the people whose descendants they had heretofore supposed to be. A bang. This is again saying, hey, the people from older times aren't quite the same people that are here right now, but Caucasians. Kim cautions that the features of individuals with a population can be expected to display a degree of variation which can be quite wide and which may overlap with that of present in a different population, and that characteristics change over time. One thing that can't change over time is Negroids have a large spade-shaped nasal aperture, and Caucasians have a slim triangle-shaped with a sill inside of it. And these people are so good at this that they can just flip over a scale, look at his nose. Within a half second, they're like, Caucasian, Caucasian, Negroid, Caucasian, Negro, Caucasian. They can do it that fast because it's that simple. Now, if they really want to look into it and all these other things and get out their little protractors and their craniometers and stuff like that and start going around with capillaries and figuring out things and sizes and comparing it to other sizes, sure, it's something that we did with people all around the world in ancient times. There's a lot of old footage of people doing this type of thing. So, anyhow, guys, Kim cautions that these features can be expected to display a degree of variation which can be quite wide, which may overlap, and that present in a different population, and that characteristics change over time. He states the samples are available are microscopically small and only tiny, sad and unrepresentative remnant of the approximately 200,000 people who lived in Egypt over the 4,000 years of the civilization's history. In particular, he notes that these analyses are dominated by sampling bias, and the bones from the northern regions are rare, while bones are much better preserved in the dry deserts of the south next to Nubia, and that these items thus make up a disproportionate proportion of the available samples. Ding. Kemp argues that the black-white argument, though politically understandable, is an oversimplification that hinders an appropriate evaluation of the scientific data on the ancient Egyptians, since it doesn't take into consideration the difficulty in ascertaining complexion from skeletal remains. But we're not talking about skin color in any way, shape, or form, and they damn well know it, but it's his way to try to get out of it, and then somebody throwing this in there. Again, we can see a hand at work. It also ignores the fact that Africa is inhabited by many other populations besides Bantu-related Negro groups. So this is the giant slap in the Congoid, Negroid, West African belief that all of Africa is one big homogeneous society, and we was in Egypt. No, you didn't even actually know Egypt existed, and it's real sad that you act the way that you do now. It actually shows your jealousy and hatred. And it's kind of pathetic. And by kind, I mean a whole lot. And let's continue. He asserts that in reconstructions of life in ancient Egypt, modern Egyptians would therefore be the most logical and closest approximation to the ancient Egyptians. In other words, everybody around there right now, the closest one around there now would be the people living there now, of course. It wouldn't be any of these Negroid and admixed people or any of that silly stuff. Anthropologist Nancy Lowell states the following: there is now a sufficient body of evidence from modern studies of skeletal remains to indicate that the ancient Egyptians, especially southern Egyptians, exhibited physical characteristics that are within the range of variation for ancient and modern indigenous peoples of the Saharan tropical Africa, Caucasians. The distribution of population characteristics seem to follow a lineal pattern from south to north, which may be explained by natural selection as well as gene flow between neighboring populations. In general, the inhabitants of Upper Egypt and Nubia had the greatest biological affinity to people of the Sahara and more southerly areas. So, B must be placed in the context of hypothesis informed by archaeological, linguistic, geographic, and other data, which points to Caucasian, Caucasian, Caucasian. In such context, the physical anthropological evidence indicates that early Nile Valley populations can be identified as part of an African lineage of Caucasians, but exhibiting local variation. This variation represents the short and long-term effects of evolutionary forces such as gene flow, genetic drift, and natural selection influenced by culture and geography. And I think she just repeated herself twice. And then I did. This view was also shared by the late Egyptologist Frank Yurko. A 2005 study by Kita of pre-dynastic Egyptian Badarian crania found that the Badarian samples cluster more closely with Ethiopian samples than they do with Northern European Berg or Norse samples. And so here we have Kita trying to weasel a little bit and say, well, oh, it's not like a Norse person, so it can't be white. Though importantly, no Asian and Southern African samples were included in the study, and if they did, why would they? Sonia Zariski in 2007 noted that population continuity occurs over the Egyptian pre-dynastic into Greco-Roman times, and I believe there's a problem with Sonia Zariski, by the way, and that a relatively high level of genetic differentiation was sustained over this time period. She concluded, therefore, that the process of state formation itself may have been mainly an indigenous process from the Caucasians that are indigenous to North Africa, but it may have occurred in association with in-migration from Sumerians and Anatolians, particularly during the early dynastic and Old Kingdom periods. In 2008, Kita found that the early pre-dynastic groups in southern Egypt were similarly craniometrically to Nile Valley groups of Ethiopian extraction, as well as a whole dynastic Egyptians, includes both Upper and Lower Egyptians, and they show much closer affinities with these particular Northeast African populations. He also concluded that more material was needed to make a firm conclusion about the relationship between the early Holocene Nile Valley populations and later Egyptian Caucasians. You can see there's a problem a little bit with this Kita guy too, right? In 2013, Terrazas and others concluded a comparative craniologic analysis of dynastic Egyptian skulls with ancient and recent crania from other parts of Africa and found that the ancient Egyptians were morphologically closest to modern Afroasiatic speaking populations from the Horn of Africa, which have a huge Caucasian admix and Caucasian phenotypes and all that stuff. Because of that, both of these fossil series possess Middle Eastern affinities and were distinct from the analyzed prehistoric crania of North Africa and the Horn region, including the Pleistocene Rabat skull, hereto Homo sapiens idaltu fossil, and early Holocene Kef-Umtun Tuza skeleton. The scientists suggest that this may indicate the Afro-Asiatic speaking groups settled in the area during a later epoch, having possibly arrived from the Middle East. Again, Caucasians. So we can talk about limb ratios, and it's really kind of boring as hell, guys, and if it's already gotten to drain on you and my voice already, and the fact that coffee didn't kick in this morning, I'm going to have to just let this actually go here, but you can always look it up, but some simple little things that goes on here, and he just wants to let you, this does not mean the ancient Egyptians were Negroes, and so on. And, it talks about a super Negroid or something like that in there too, which is an incorrect term. And then they tear that apart, and they spend a lot of time doing it. Dental morphology also has a problem with it too, and two people battering a ball back and forth. Modern studies on ancient Egyptian dental clusters with ancient Egyptians with Caucasoids, Europeans, and Western Eurasians have a small teeth as opposed to Negroids, West Sub-Saharan Africans, who have megadont or large teeth. So in other words, Western Sub-Saharan Africans are not the Egyptians, and the closer teeth are going to be from what? Europeans and West Europeans. Let's continue. A 2006 bioarchaeological study on the dental morphology of ancient Egyptians in Upper Egypt by Joel Irish, famous, found that the dental traits were most similar to those of the other Nile Valley populations.